abstract promised, focusing mainly on the first two works, the works on theocracy. So although the photo on the screen is that of Sergei Trubertskoy, the relationship it expresses of friendship and mentoring on the part of Solov'ev is equally valid as an expression of Solov'ev's relationship to the slightly younger Prince Eugene Trubetskoy. The latter first met Solov'ev in the winter of 1886-87 at the Moscow home of the philosopher Lev Lopatin. He recalls the meetings in his posthumously published memoirs, explaining that they were immediately shouting at each other in a heated argument about Solov'ev's theocratic project. But united by their common belief in Bogachilivirchество as the principle of the communal life of the Church, the content and goal of universal history, the heat of the argument subsided and they ended the evening, their first ever meeting, laughing and joking like old friends, as indeed they remained. But the arguments about the relationship of orthodoxy to Catholicism and the papacy always returned and were always followed by a swift and deep reconciliation. Trubertskoy explains in the opening of his 1913 work on Solov'ev that he was unable to write a reflection for the 1901 collection of reminiscences about Solov'ev, which his brother compiled because of a kind of powerful obstacle which did not allow him to separate himself from his mentor. Up to 1913, he explains, all my views developed in communion with him, i.e. in part with his influence, in part in the struggle against this influence. Solov'ev's conciliatory attitude to Roman Catholicism, his negative judgment about Eastern Orthodoxy, and his idea of universal theocracy always prompted grave doubts in Trubertskoy. However, such that there arose in both my pieces of research about the religious social ideal of Western Christianity, the historical task to which I devoted myself in these works, as any attentive reader will notice, led him to a dogmatic result, to a decisive negative judgment about medieval Latin theocracy, and to an evaluation of Roman Catholicism in general as a one-sided form of legal Christianity. So this paper will examine those two early works on Western theocracy by Trubertskoy and some of the connections they suggest with the thought of Solov'ev in the last decade of his life. It will conclude by trying to reopen the question of theocracy, divine humanity, and liberalism in contemporary terms. While only a master's dissertation, Trubertskoy's work on Augustine is, of course, also an important work in its own right. Beginning in 1841, an ambitious translation program of patristic's writings into Russia had begun in the four theological academies in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kiev, and Kazan. The Latin fathers were allocated to the academy at Kiev, and Father Cyprian Kern, in his invaluable reference work on this project, published over half a century ago, reveals that the complete works of Augustine were published in 8 volumes by the Academy of Kiev under the direction of A.I. Bulgakov between 1879 and 1895. Trubertskoy, of course, was not dependent on this translation project or even necessarily familiar with it, but it does situate his work within an increasingly strong body of Russian patristic scholarship. Trubertskoy read Augustine in the original Latin and drew primarily upon contemporary German scholarship in his evaluation of the great Latin father. Like his brother, who had attended Harnack's lectures in Berlin and becomes friend with the preeminent Protestant historian of dogma, the younger Trubertskoy's theological views were increasingly shaped by liberal Protestant scholarship. Solov'ev had, on the other hand, been shaped much more by Catholic historical scholarship and exegesis in the 1880s. Nikolai Kotrelev has demonstrated that Solov'ev was much impressed by the work of Johann Janssen, a German Catholic priest and historian, and he wrote a lengthy article in a review of this work published in Pravoslavnoye Umozrenie in August 1885. Plus, Solov'ev's 1886 essay on the Didache, the teaching of the 12 apostles, which his brother had translated into Russian, shows him more accurately dating the recently discovered document of the early church than Harnack. With regard to divine humanity or deification, it's worth bearing in mind that Harnack was part of the liberal German school which was sharply critical of this teaching. In terms of Bogachilivirchество, therefore, Harnack was not a good influence on the brothers Trubertskoy. In Trubertskoy's assessment, Augustine was never able to fully overcome the dualism of his youth. In his ethical worldview, Trubertskoy argues that the human element is belittled, doomed to a purely passive role. In his system, there is no place for human freedom. And he says, between the two poles, the force of evil in perverted human nature and the invincible force of grace, Trubertskoy claims that the human being is nothing. His freedom is entirely swallowed up from below or above, everything going into sin or grace. Here, perhaps we can see the origins of an often one-sided presentation of a negative Western anthropology that is present in the work of leading 20th century Orthodox scholars, such as Mirosozertsanie and even Metropolitan Kallistos Ware. Trubertskoy explains that the attempt to overcome this dualist position was the living nerve of Augustine's philosophy. And in meeting St Ambrose, he met someone who personified in himself the church not only as an external unity, but as an intellectual order, as an organic interior unity. The Donatist schism prompted Augustine to focus on preserving church unity above all else. In this way he becomes, according to Trubertskoy, swayed by judicial Latin sentiments and defends the church state against the anti-church and anti-state Donatists. Similarly, the threat of Pelagian heresy lay, I quote, in the denial of organic social unity and in rebellion against the mystical, organized action of grace. For the sake of the salvation of society, this destructive principle must be forcibly curbed and suppressed. The collective unity of the church organism for the masses can only be compulsory forced. And this, Trubertskoy says, explains the peculiarities of Augustine's teaching about grace. As a result, defending church unity above all else, Augustine laid the foundations for medieval Catholic theocracy. And the city of God is that ideal plan, the program which medieval Catholicism sought to accomplish. In short, Trubertskoy considered Augustine's teaching a false representation of Christianity, a denial of divine humanity. Evidently, this is, as he acknowledges, a somewhat critical take on the Western Latin position, which Solov'ev did not share. He didn't view the teaching of Augustine, or more broadly the Western Catholic tradition about grace, as an obstacle to divine humanity. Shortly before returning to Russia from France in the late 1880s, for example, he wrote to Eugene Trubetskoy that he had read Molina's De Concordiatio Gratiae cum libero arbitrio and the posthumous work of Cardinal Franzelin, De Ecclesia Christi. Molina's work was written in response to Domingo Barnes, the Dominican spiritual director of St. Teresa of Avila. This is the Jesuit response to the Dominicans. Molina's work was a crucial starting point for any post-Reformation Catholic theology of the relationship between grace and free will. Solov'ev's sure grasp of the theological themes involved is revealed in his Brockhaus Ephron articles of the 1890s, which he wrote about free will. Here he praises particularly St. Bernard on the question of free will, as well as singling out the position of Francisco Suarez, who developed Molina's ideas further with the idea of congruent grace. Justification of the Good is a work which reflects the influence of Augustine, as Solov'ev himself suggested in response to a review of his work. He's noted that as the writer, the reviewer, points out in blissful state of ignorance of St Augustine, who wrote 22 books in justification of divine providence, that a justification of the good is against nature. And Ernst Radloff, one of the first biographers and friend of Solov'ev, devoted nearly half his biographical sketch to justification, addressing a number of significant points, including the influence of St. Augustine, especially with regard to free will. Towards the end of justification, Solov'ev explains the operation of grace in his handling of the conversion of the Roman centurion Cornelius. And immediately apparent here, the beginning of this is an acceptance of the Augustinian notion of prevenient grace. The specifically human actions conformable to the grace of God, and here he adds in italics, and caused by its preliminary influence, must obviously express man's normal relationship to God, to men, and his own material nature, in accordance with the three general foundations of morality: piety, pity, and shame. And a similar acceptance of an Augustinian position is evident in his Brockhaus-Ephron article on free will with regard to Pelagius. In such a way, the good is possible for man only by the action of the divine principle, revealing itself in man and through him, but not from him. Such action is called grace. Already for someone to want the help of grace, it is necessary that grace itself has acted in him. By his personal efforts, he not only cannot do or fulfill the good, but nor even desire or seek it. It's reasonable to assume, therefore, that Trubetskoy's work on Augustine did not prevent his mentor from appreciating the work of the great Latin father. I should add that this complements what is much more broadly a position that, of St. Maximus Confessor as the influence in Solov'ev's Bogatyla Vechstva. And Maximus, obviously, is the theologian of the two wills in Christ and the theologian of the Sixth Ecumenical Council. So there's a complementarity, Maximus and Augustine, in the late Solov'ev. It wasn't there. Lectures is much more Maximus. With regard to Trubetskoy's work on Pope St. Gregory VII, an 11th century Western theocracy, Solov'ev wrote a valuable review in which he praises Trubetskoy as a gifted young scholar for this important contribution to recent Russian historical literature. Interestingly, he observes that the medieval understanding about papal power is outlined without sufficient theological accuracy, arguing that Trubetskoy's account of the medieval idea of papal power, which is expressed in the letters of Gregory VII, does not sufficiently distinguish between the interest of personal piety and the interest of the practical tasks of the theocracy. Trubertskoy claims that for medieval believers, the Apostle Peter, as it were, obscures Christ, Solov'ev notes, and he explains this with regard to the public side of the church. Here Christ is obscured by Peter, just as Peter, in his turn, is obscured by the Pope. But the key thing for Solov'ev, which Trubetskoy misses, is the fact that next to Christ, in the Middle Ages, stands not Peter and not the Pope, but only the Mother of God. Here's a remarkable and decisive fact, Solov'ev adds. In the legal structure of medieval theocracy, which Trubetskoy presents, there's no place for the Madonna, and our author does not mention one word about her, it appears. But in actual medieval religion, she is unarguably first. A further point he raised with regard to Trubetskoy's mischaracterization of the papal office, which he presents as if the rank itself of the Pope makes its carrier a holy man. The extent to which this is unfounded is already clear from the fact that the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, like now, recognizes some popes as saints, and consequently thereby declares the rest of the popes non-saints. Of course, Trubetskoy expresses similar misgivings about Gregory VII as he does with Augustine. Towards the end of the book, his view is summarized. So far as Gregory VII and other teachers of the Middle Ages demand that legal order ruled not only inside separate states, but also in the international sphere, and so far as they want all peoples developed into a peaceful community of truth, they undoubtedly stand on the ground of universal Christian principles. But as for the domination of one power, one law over humanity, serves for them as a higher aim, and they equate the divine kingdom with the external hierarchical organization, and they mix the legal order with the order of grace, their Christianity is legalistic, one-sided Christianity. Solov'ev's view is that this overall evaluation is misguided, and he asks, in what way could Gregory VII and other teachers of the Middle Ages consider papal monarchy as a higher aim? Had they renounced, he asked, the Christian dogma about the second coming of Christ and about the life of the future ages, where there will be no other power apart from God's, and this divine power coincides with love? What makes the legalistic prioritizing of papal power over all else, which Trubetskoy argues for, so nonsensical to Solov'ev, is the eschatological sensitivities of the age. We know, he continues, to the contrary, that if they sinned in anything in this regard, it was only in the premature expectation of the end of the world, and consequently, the implementation of a higher aim had nothing in common with legality. These Christians, not accepting Gregory VII, unceasingly awaited the end of the world and the final judgment. It's psychologically impossible in such expectation the serious character of which our author fully acknowledges, to think and act for the manifestation on earth of any kind of normal order, when now or tomorrow this earth and all its affairs must burn away. In the view of the people of the Middle Ages, the last times had already arrived. The universal catastrophe had already began. Who, seeing the fire already burning in their house, would begin to think about putting the house in order, about its best furnishing and decoration. Given this, Solov'ev asks, how should one explain the tireless and immense activity of Gregory VII for the sake of the whole Christian world? He himself gives the explanation in these biblical words, which, before death, he expressed the meaning of his life. I love truth, and I hate disorder, for the sake of which I die in exile. He lived not for the accomplishment of any ideal, any kind of ideal, but because he loved truth and hated lawlessness. This is sufficient motive for the activity of such a man. The truth does not lose its force even on the eve of the final judgment, when there cannot be any talk of an earthly idea. The medieval world felt itself lying deeply in extreme evil, and the struggle with this evil was not an ideal, but simply the moral duty of all Christians. The scope and character of the struggle was defined providentially by the personal situation of each called, and called, as he believed, by the personal will of God to be the high representative of the whole Christian world in these worst of times. Gregory VII had to defend truth in the whole universe, obeying the higher authority given to him, and of course not expecting the actual accomplishment of the ideal order on this earth. This evaluation of Gregory VII by Solov'ev resonates quite strongly with that much-cited apparent contradiction in his own work between the optimism of justification of the good and the apocalyptic tenor of his final work, which includes the second coming of Christ in the superb short story on the Antichrist. Solov'ev also notes the inappropriateness of the very terminology of religious social ideal and ideal. Simply, these did not exist in medieval times, and there was nothing that could even begin to correspond to their meaning. Solov'ev lastly defends the practical activity of Gregory VII as directed not to the higher aim, but to the lower necessities of everyday social life. It wasn't the legal character of the church that was the principal deficiency of the medieval system, Solov'ev argues, but the inescapable collision of two higher powers, and the fact that there was no third organ of theocracy to mediate between the king and the pope. Solov'ev does praise Trubertskoy significantly. If he sees Trubertskoy as anachronistic in projecting modern terminology upon the medieval world system, he also emphasizes that in his analysis of investitures, one of the key areas Gregory VII sought to reform, Trubertskoy highlights the typically false modern understanding of this topic. As Solov'ev explains, usually the struggle of Gregory VII against Henry is presented as a typical example of the antagonism between spiritual power and worldly power. He notes that Trubertskoy highlights the fallacy of such a view because the German Empire, because worldly power in our current sense in general did not exist in the Middle Ages, and the German Empire less than any other foundation might correspond to such an understanding. The ecclesial power and state power equally have a holy character, and also both have spiritual sides indistinguishably linked to the material. Trubertskoy himself summarized his research into the investitures crisis or reform by explaining that the dispute about investitures is not a struggle between church and state, but the clash of two forms, two organs of theocracy, a struggle between a royal priesthood and a holy kingdom. It was first of all a question about the mutual relationship of the two heads of theocracy, about the rights of a holy power, of holy power over royal, and about the holy authority of royal power. Ironically, given the fact that Trubertskoy trenchantly opposed the idea of a unity of church and state, this fundamental recognition of two sacred powers in operation in the Middle Ages resonates powerfully with a groundbreaking 2017 work on medieval history by Andrew Willard Jones entitled Before Church and State, a study of social order in the sacramental kingdom of St. Louis IX. This study of the medieval society and the papacy 2 centuries after St. Gregory VII argues persuasively to show that church and state are modern expressions with no real meaning for the medieval period. Much medieval history has been written using anachronistic terminology. But bookending the detailed historical research of this work, Willard Jones attempts to draw out some of the conclusions for modern society, especially with regard to the church. Ultimately, the question arises about the very existence of the secular, which is seemingly taken for granted as the status quo in Western liberal democracy. This approach can equally be applied to both Solov'ev and Trubertskoy in their dealing with liberalism and dealing with theocracy in the late 19th century in Russia. How are we to regard their thought, who both of them were aware of the essential falseness of the modern application of modern terminology upon the medieval period? In the light of this tension, namely that Bogachila Vechestva can't fit into categories of modern political thought and sovereignty, can divine humanity be adapted to fit a society where there's a separation of church and state? Surely, theologically speaking, the idea of the secular is a lie. As Solov'ev says in Justification, it would be impious to consider anything existing outside the reach of grace. The whole thrust of the teaching about Bogachila Vechestva is that it is, and whether one puts the emphasis on it being the church or universal humanity, is the fruit of the incarnation, which has established a new ontological order of being. And this is why, after the failure of his 1880s theocratic project, Solov'ev still uses the term free theocracy, which dates back to the lectures on divine humanity, and why he argues in Justification that the purpose of the state is to freely serve the church. Trubertskoy, in his worldview, of course, criticizes him for this by using the term theocracy, because for Trubertskoy, theocracy means the use of force. But what Solov'ev is trying to do in Justification and using this, if you like, ambiguous idea of free theocracy, in practical terms, very optimistic, resembles in some way the idea of virtue politics propounded in Britain by John Milbank. And he's trying to maintain the logic of divine humanity. For Solov'ev, everything ultimately was directed to building the kingdom of God. The whole sphere of man's social existence can at least begin to be sanctified. It can become divine human, it can be deified. But for this to happen, it can only be a free act, a free surrender to and cooperation with divine grace. And this requires progress in the moral life of humanity on a dramatic scale. Unlike Solov'ev, Trubertskoy appears to push his understanding of Bogachila Vechestva into the transcendent sphere, almost to make room for the state. Perhaps there's an echo of Bediah's more eschatological approach to the theme. Surely, in doing so, there's a danger of denying the very essence of Bogachila Vechestva, namely the incarnation, who, as Solov'ev says and John Paul II repeats after him, is the center of history and the center of the universe. The extent to which Trubertskoy's political views could cohere with his philosophical and religious perspective expressed in Smysl zhizni is a question beyond the remit of this paper, but it goes without saying that his practical political action, just like Solov'ev's in the 1880s, ended in failure.